But we have before us some wonderful things tonight because we're going to have a particular look, as you can see from the title, at what's happening in Russia, through Russia being in Syria, and the things that are happening between Russia and Turkey. And this crowd called ISIS that have brought so much of a challenge to many nations in the last 12 or 18 months. We're going to have a look at that, but we're going to do it in the context of that reading that we've just had in Daniel 7, which we'll come to later on, where we had the description of the residue. There is a crisis in the residue, as we're going to see. Well, first of all, I want to start with Ukraine. We did have a brief mention of what's happening in the Ukraine this afternoon, but of course, Putin is determined to take hold of the Ukraine. And he wants that because, of course, it was the original homeland of the Rus, of the Russians. They established their first capital as a power in Kiev, which happens to be the capital of Ukraine today, way back in 882 AD. And of course, there's a lot of things been happening there over the years. In fact, going right back to 1992, there have been 1,500 troops in what they call the Transnistria, a region of Moldova, where there is an independence movement that is fighting against the Ukrainian government. We've got the Ukrainian rebels over here on the eastern side of the Ukraine who've established the Donetsk People's Republic, and they are supported both by troops and by weaponry by the Russians. And of course, we all know that in March last year, Russia annexed the Crimean Peninsula and seized hold of the port of Sebastopol, which is so important to their naval operations in the Mediterranean and in the Black Sea. So there's a lot of things been happening there, and they're going to continue to happen because Putin's not going to rest until he's got control of the original homeland of the Russian Empire. He is rebuilding the Russian Empire, and that's why he's going to ultimately seize it. And of course, the latest thing, December 2015, Russia and the Vatican together objected to attacks and seizures of cathedrals and property of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, of the Moscow Patriarch in Ukraine by radical nationalists. So there's this reaction within Ukraine, and then now these radicals in the Ukraine are seizing hold of Russian Orthodox churches in the Ukraine. That's only going to aggravate the situation, isn't it? So you can see how step by step it's moving towards the inevitable end. You know, how relevant is this 1979 Time magazine cover? Way back in 1979, we had the Time magazine with the Russian bear looking down on what it calls the crescent of crisis. Isn't that amazing? And of course, Brother Thomas wrote in Help Us Israel in his preface, he said, the future movements of Russia are notable signs of the times because they are predicted in the scriptures of truth. We're going to have a look at some of that this evening. You know, way back 120 years ago, brothers and sisters and young people, Brother Roberts gave a lecture on this very subject. Now, Russia and Turkey have fought 12 major wars and many other mini-wars in their history between 1568 and 1918. And Brother Roberts, with that background, gave a lecture called The Eastern Question, because, of course, from the UK, over in Turkey and the Middle East, that was in the East. So he gave this lecture on the Eastern Question, using that cartoon of a Russian bear sort of holding on to a turkey. All right? You get the picture? He's got the turkey in his grasp. Well, little has changed in all of that time, because this is what's been happening of late. Now, what you can see there, of course, is the nation of Turkey, and up there in the top left-hand corner, you've got Istanbul, and of course we have the problem that's occurred recently on the 24th of November, when the Turks, way down here on the Syrian border, shot down a Russian bomber. And of course that's caused a lot of trouble between Russia and Turkey ever since. And what's happening is that up here in the Bosphorus, and as you can see, this is an enlargement. This is well, it's Istanbul called today. Used to be called Constantinople. This is the Bosphorus, which is the Russian access from the Black Sea to the Sea of Marmara and the Aegean Sea, and therefore to the Mediterranean. And what's been happening there of late is quite interesting, because you see Turkey responding to the way Russia is treating them. They've said, well, hang on, we might just delay these Russian ships that they want to get through from the Black Sea to the Aegean. We'll make sure that we go through all the paperwork and we'll slow it down. And that's what they've been doing. The latest incident was that when one of these Russian destroyers got out into the Aegean, and there was a Turkish vessel, some kind of fishing vessel apparently in its way, it fired a shot across its bows. So they're starting now to use weapons in this little contest that's going on. Now this article in the Sputnik International, it's an interesting name for a rag, isn't it? Sputnik International. On the 1st of December 2015, said dozens of Russian ships have reportedly been waiting for hours near the Bosphorus Strait to get the go-ahead from Turkey to be able to pass through the waterway. In a clear violation of international norms, Turkish authorities have created hurdles for Russian vessels passing through the Bosphorus Strait. As a result, dozens of Russian ships have been waiting for hours to obtain the green light from Turkey for their passage. So how do you think the Russians would respond to that? Well, it's tit for tat, isn't it? And that's exactly what's happening. So this is what was reported in the Globe and Mail of the 30th of November 2015. Trucks carrying Turkish exports blocked at Russian border. And so the Russians are saying, well, if you're going to stop our ships from going through the Bosphorus, we're going to stop your trucks from carrying your exports into the countries to the north. And so around 1,250 trucks have been stuck there. You know, you wouldn't want to be a truck driver, would you, on the Turkish border with Russia. So they're stuck there waiting for the Russians to give them approval. And of course, that kind of thing's going on. You know, Forbes magazine named Vladimir Putin for the 3rd year in a row the world's most powerful person. And this is what they said in the article, 5th of November 2015, it was reported, Putin continues to prove he's one of the few men in the world powerful enough to do what he wants and, more importantly, get away with it. And hasn't that been the case, brothers and sisters, young people and friends, in the last few years? He seems to be able to do what he wants and he gets away with it. Nobody else can get away with it. So what does he want? Well, have a look at this. In the top news of the 24th of September 2015, Vladimir Putin had a meeting with the president of Turkey, Erdogan, and this is what he said. He was threatening the Turkish president. This is before the bombers shot down, all right? This is well before that. We read this. He said, if necessary, we can stage a swift military coup d'etat against you. I will defeat you and your American master in Syria. I think they got the message. And when they shot the bomber down, Putin said, Turkey is going to pay twice for this. They're paying right now, but he said they're going to pay twice for this. Have a guess. You've got one guess what the second payment might be. I think we know from Scripture what the second payment might be. Their day is coming. You know, cartoonists are having a field day, aren't they, with what's going on between Russia and Turkey. And they're making all sorts of pictures up. Looks like I'm having turkey for Christmas, says Putin. Fine, I'll roast my own turkey. Or, better grab a ham, because there might not be any turkey left by Christmas. So I think you get the idea. And this is why the world, of course, is focusing on what's happening there. They want to know what's going on, and they want to know why Russia's in Syria. Well, tonight we're going to have a look at that scripturally. We're going to see exactly why Russia is in Syria and where that is heading. You know, they're not content, Russia, with sort of sparring with Turkey. They're making what would be considered, under normal circumstances, ludicrous demands. And here on the 26th of November 2015, the Turks received a demand from Moscow that they return the Hagia Sophia to the Orthodox Church. Now think about that. They're demanding that this building that's sort of right in the middle of Istanbul, which is a landmark, it's been there for centuries. It was, of course, at one time the great church of the Greek Orthodox Church. And when the Turks came in and they fled off, in fact the religion fled to Russia and we established the Russian Orthodox Church, they turned it into a Muslim mosque for a time. Now it's a Muslim museum. Russia is saying, we want it back. That's ours. And one day they are going to get it back, aren't they? We know that well. So then, have you ever seen this? This is Putin's new war room. Ever seen pictures of this? Have a look at that. It's brand spanking new. Look at all these people here. There's nobody chewing gum, nobody smoking, all right? They're all focused. You know why they're focused? See this man up here? You might not be able to see him, but you see there's a black suited man up here? That just happens to be Vladimir Putin. And he's sitting in this war room looking down all of these technicians who are using their machinery. And what are they doing? Do you see over on the left-hand side here, this what looks like part of a screen? Well, let's take another picture of this. Let's come around a bit. This is some kind of technological gadget that allows them to see exactly what's going on in Syria and Turkey. They can see every single movement. They've got satellites looking down. They can see everything that's happening in Syria and in Turkey. They must have spent squillions to build that. It's brand spanking new. Now, you don't go to that kind of trouble, do you, unless you have some plans in mind. Yeah, and he's got plans in mind, undoubtedly. So let's just turn now to why this is happening. Why does Putin have this new war room? Well, because he's been threatened and because he does have plans for the future. So who is this ISIS crowd that we hear so much of? Well, ISIS is an acronym that stands for the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. They're also known as ISIL, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. So what's the Levant? Well, the Levant is an area including Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, Cyprus, Palestine, and a southern part of Turkey and Israel. That's a pretty big area. So ISIS wants to establish their caliphate over that territory. They want this Islamic kingdom or caliphate to be established. And in the process, they've made it quite plain that Russia is in their way, that many other peoples are in their way. They emerged in 2011 in Iraq as an outgrowth of Al-Qaeda, which now regards ISIS as too extreme. Can you believe that? Al-Qaeda believes that ISIS is far too extreme for them. I mean, Al-Qaeda was they're the guys that blew up the Twin Towers with aircraft. But no, ISIS is obviously too extreme. They've recruited rebel fighters from Syria and Western fighters from all over, including Australia. They come from France, they come from Germany, they come from the UK, and they've gone to fight for this crowd. And the acts of ISIS, of course, are well known. They've captured large areas of Syria and Iraq in 2014 and early 2015. And when they entered those areas, they indiscriminately beheaded and butchered all non-Muslims and anybody else that they perceived to be an enemy. They took the women, particularly of the Christian people of that area, they took their women and turned them into slaves. I don't need to spell out what kind of slaves. All right? What awful things have been happening under this mob ISIS. They are credited with more than 1,000 civilian deaths outside of Iraq and Syria, so forget about what's happening there, just outside in other countries, 1,000 deaths. In January 2015, there were 20 dead in Paris attacks on Charlie Hebdo and the Jewish kosher shop. In October 2015, a Russian plane was downed over the Sinai by a bomb evidently planted by an ISIS cell in the Sinai region. In November 2015, their multiple coordinated attacks in Paris killed 130 people. That's still pretty raw and fresh, as you know. And they happen to control some areas, vital areas, in both Syria and Iraq. Now, you see this sort of like spider web here, this yellowish colour? This is the areas under ISIS control. You know why it's only sort of like spider web here? They're the roads. They're the access roads between the major cities. And so ISIS has got, a reasonably large area here, but they don't worry about that. Providing they control the roads that lead between the cities, they got control, haven't they? And that's what they've done. And they're there like this sticky, gooey stuff that's stuck on Syria and Iraq. And more than that, brethren and sisters, they have made some threats. They've reached out across this world in just 2 years. There are cells in North America. They're all over Europe, Middle East and Northern Africa. We've got them in Australia. We've got ISIS-related people in Australia. So they've reached out. They are a danger to every nation upon earth. And you see, when you sit back and say, well, hang on, let's just pause here a minute. Let's just step back a few months or 12 months and see what the world situation was before this threat of ISIS really got going and before the Paris attacks. What was the attitude of the European nations, for example, towards Russia? Well, there were many hurdles with Russia, weren't there? For years, Russia and NATO have been at loggerheads over European security, and Russia's been flying their planes over parts of the NATO areas and, sort of just nudging the NATO powers. There's been trouble with that. The European Union has strong sanctions against Russia over the Ukrainian crisis, and the world has not forgotten or forgiven the simple grab of the Crimean Peninsula in February 2014. And Russia's unilateral entry into Syria to support Bashar al-Assad, of course, in September of this year, has really made the world sit up and take notice. Russian attacks on anti-Assad forces, as well as ISIS, has aggravated the Western powers who want Assad removed. But it's all changed, hasn't it? Yeah, they've had these huge hurdles with Russia, but suddenly, after the Paris attacks, it's changed. And now they're talking in terms of a new alliance between Russia and those who are the enemies of ISIS. So here we have now Russia and France. And in fact, France wants the US to join this alliance against ISIS, to destroy it. And Putin and the President of France, Hollande, have agreed to close military cooperation against ISIS. France has not called on NATO to do this. They haven't gone to NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation. They've gone straight to Russia for help. This is the nation they've got sanctions against because of their activity in Ukraine. And a French carrier has been joined by a Russian carrier in the Mediterranean to deploy against ISIS. The Western powers are being squeezed into a compromise on Assad. They want him out. The Russians say, no, he's staying. If the people want him to stay, he's staying. And so they're at loggerheads about the future of Bashar al-Assad. But ISIS has made a serious mistake. It's a suicidal mistake. In September 2014, they threatened Putin personally over his support for Assad in Syria. ISIS said that their caliphate, their state, would free the southern Muslim Russian states, the Stan states, from Kremlin control, that they would liberate the Chechens from under Russian control, that they would ultimately, through their agents in the area of Russia, they would capture Moscow. Well, can you imagine Vladimir Putin sitting back, sipping a cup of tea, saying, well, it doesn't matter? No, they signed their death warrant when they personally threatened Vladimir Putin. And we're going to see that it won't be long and that death warrant will be fulfilled. November 2015, Putin vowed to hunt down ISIS wherever they were. I mean, he's a very coarse man. He talks about, if they're in the toilet, I'll get them there. That's the sort of, he's a very, very coarse man. He says, I'll hunt them down wherever they are to revenge the downing of the Russian tourist flight over the Sinai. And this headline appeared in the Daily Express in the UK on the 17th of November 2015. End of ISIS? Putin sending 150,000 soldiers to Syria to wipe out evil Islamic State. Yeah, it's pretty obvious what his intentions are. Now, that's all very interesting. It's all very worrying to people who don't know where this is heading, but for Bible students, it's not a problem, is it? We get excited about this because we can see Bible prophecy being fulfilled. So why is Russia in Syria? Well, the Time magazine had a take on it in October 2015. The heading of this, the cover of the Time magazine was, Russia just wants to be friends. Yeah. You can see the grin on the Russian bear's face, can't you? Yeah, they just want to be friends. Well, the Bible has a different message, as you're going to see in a moment. But you see, things are shifting. Iraq is in the process of shifting sides. We read this article from Reuters, the 7th of October. Iraq leans toward Russia in war on Islamic State. Iraq may request Russian airstrikes. Look at the words in yellow there, and wants Moscow to have a bigger role than the United States in the war against the militant group, head of the Parliament's Defence and Security Committee said. So there's a shift there. The Iraqi Prime Minister has said he would welcome Russian airstrikes on Islamic State militants in Iraq and powerful Iranian-backed Shiite militias, hope for a partnership with Russia to counter US influence. So things are on the shift in Iraq. So when you look at the situation that is going on in the Middle East, and in fact in that entire region, brothers and sisters and young people, it's all based upon the hatreds that exist between two parts of the Muslim community. Now you see the blue colours here, the very dark blue and the lighter blues. This is the Sunni Muslims. Well, guess what ISIS is? They're Sunni Muslims. And you see the greenish areas, pretty dark here, Iraq and Iran. Well, this is the Shia areas. Now the Sunnis and the Shias hate each other with a passion. And so this is the source of the problems that are occurring there. The confusion that is caused by this fact is immense. And this is why nations, they're juggling with something that can't be managed. But one day things are going to happen because of the way that God has set this up. ISIS is Sunni and seeks to establish a caliphate, and the centre of that caliphate just happens to be here. And of course that means they've got to deal with the Shias in the process. Now we read from Daniel chapter 7 this evening. And Daniel chapter 7 and verse 7 is the verse I want to focus on for a short while. Now we've had enough paper clippings, etc. Let's get down to what the Bible says about the future of this area. And it's very plain what the future is. There are 3 passages in the scripture that speak about the future of this area. There's Ezekiel chapter 38 and verse 5, which says that one of the confederates of the Gogian confederacy that comes down upon the mountains of Israel is Persia. Now we read Persia, we think Iran. No. Persia includes Iran, but it's a much bigger territory than that. In fact, it's quite a much bigger territory than that, as you're going to see. So there's the one passage. Now, by itself, it wouldn't prove very much. But when you come to references like Daniel 7 verse 7 and Daniel 11:40, then you add to that. You expand upon what Ezekiel 38 verse 5 means. So in Daniel chapter 7 and at verse 7 we read, "And after this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, and strong exceedingly, and it had great iron teeth." Now the iron, of course, we know is the symbol for the Roman Empire. So this is the 4th beast of the 4 that would dominate world history in the times of the Old Testament and beyond. You had Babylon, you had Medo-Persia, you had Greece, and then you had Rome. And they're spelled out there in those first few verses of Daniel chapter 7, using the symbology of animals or wild beasts, because they would treat God's people as wild beasts treat their prey. It goes on to say this about this 4th beast. It's got these great iron teeth, and it devoured and brake in pieces. Well, that was certainly true of the history of the Roman Empire. But you see the words in the green there? "And stamped the residue with the feet of it." They, in fact, have not been fulfilled in the history of the Roman Empire. That's yet to happen. And I'm going to show you that by a series of maps. It's yet to happen. It was diverse, it says, this empire, from all the beasts, all the empires that were before it, and it had 10 horns. So then, let's have a look at these empires that preceded the Roman Empire. There was the Assyro-Babylonian Empire. It reached its height, of course, in the times of Nebuchadnezzar, but it was actually established by Nimrod a long time before. But it was relatively small. I mean, it included, this is not too bad in terms of the Middle East, is it? Quite a reasonable size kingdom was the Babylonian. But it was followed, in fact, it was swallowed up by the next empire, which was the Medo-Persians. Now, the one thing, if you read down through Daniel 7, the one thing that becomes very evident is that each successive empire consumes the one that was before it. It gobbles up the one that was before it. So the Medo-Persians had a much bigger territory than the Babylonians. The Babylonians were here. The Medo-Persians were right over in Macedonia, right over here to the Indus River, and of course into Egypt. That was a massive territory. But they were then swallowed up by Alexander's empire. Along came the Grecians. And you can see it's a very similar area. This area that goes from Macedonia right over to the Indus River and includes Egypt. But then along came the Roman Empire in 67 BC and beyond. And have a look at its territory. Well, most of it's over here in Europe, in the West, in North Africa. Yeah, there's a little bit. They had Israel, of course. They had this area we call Turkey today. They did, in fact, get up to the head of the Persian Gulf. But Trajan had a lot of trouble with the Parthians over here, who actually occupy what we would call Iran today. He couldn't get in there. The Parthians made life too difficult, and he had to pull back. In fact, in 118 AD, Hadrian pulled back from Trajan's conquests in the east of the Euphrates. He abandoned them and he built a series of forts running in a north-south direction through modern Jordan and Syria. And you can go there today and stand in them. They're still there. Every Roman mile, you've got this fort. That was the eastern border of the Roman Empire. So when you look at those maps, if you can just remember the configurations, what do you think the residue might be? If each of these successive empires gobbles up the previous one, what do you think might be the residue of what the Roman Empire did not gobble up of the Persian and Grecian Empire? Well, it was all of that area to the east of Syria. Yeah. It's what's called the residue. It's that area. It was never captured by the Romans. But you see, we are being told in Daniel 7 verse 7 that that has to happen. Now, how's it going to happen? Well, it can't happen in history. It didn't happen in history. It has to happen when this fourth beast is revived. And that beast has to be revived. Because when you read Daniel 7 verse 11, it says this: "And I beheld then, because of the voice of the great words which the horn spake, I beheld even till the beast," this is the fourth beast, by the way, "till the beast was slain, and his body destroyed, and given to the burning flame." Now that's a reference to the destruction of this fourth beast or fourth empire, the Roman Empire, by the Lord Jesus Christ and his saints. Now you can't destroy something that's not there. So it has to be revived, as we were speaking about that this afternoon, remember? We're actually watching the restoration, the reformation of that fourth beast. And what is happening in Europe is going to see these 10 kingdoms to the south of the Rhine and the Danube form the old Roman Empire, on the old Roman Empire, reform that empire. And so the task of that empire, obviously associated with Russia, with Gog, is to take the residue with the feet of it. Now, you see ISIS sort of springing out? They're a problem, aren't they? They're right there in that residue, yes. And of course, in September 2015, Russia moved its troops and its aircraft into Syria. Iran is helping its fellow Shiite government in Iraq against the Sunni ISIS. ISIS threatened Russia directly in September 2014 and said, we're going to release the Chechens up here from Russian control. Yep, you can see where this is all leading, can't you? It's leading to the fact that the day is coming, brothers and sisters, when the Russian troops in Syria, having won the day there, will move east. They will move east to conquer this territory, and that's going to change the entire landscape of the Middle East. ISIS hates the name Daesh. You heard that name used of ISIS? They hate the name Daesh because it's an adapted acronym of their Arabic name. Now, I can't speak Arabic. If Pete Bloom was up here, he'd better spell out that, whatever that is there, all right? He can speak a bit of Arabic. But it's similar to another Arabic word, das, all right, which means to trample down or crush. And we read in Daniel 7 verse 7 that this revived fourth beast is going to stamp the residue with the feet of it. Yeah, and we can see this coming. It is coming. Now I want you to come to the third of these references, to Daniel chapter 11 and verse 40. So this is the reason why Russia is in Syria. Putin has plans. Now, look, even Vladimir Putin might not have as expansive a plan as we're reading of here in the prophecy of Daniel, but events will change that. He'll end up having an expansive plan. Do you remember that in 1979 the Russians went into Afghanistan? Do you recall that they spent 10 years there, lost 50,000 men, 15,000 tanks? Remember that? Because the Americans fed the Mujahideen with all sorts of weapons, which were later on used to build Al-Qaeda. Remember that? And they left in 1989 in humiliation. Russians do not like being humiliated, especially Vladimir Putin. So they would have rewritten the military handbook on Afghanistan. Because the reason that they couldn't take Afghanistan and conquer it was that they did not take the mountain ranges on the east and on the west. The mountain range between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And you know that the Taliban are hiding out in that mountain range in Pakistan. They can't be touched. There's a mountain range between Afghanistan and Iran. So if you're going to rewrite the manual, and you failed the last time, because you didn't take those mountain ranges and cut off supply routes, what do you reckon they're going to do next time? Take both sides. And it's exactly what they're going to do. They're going to take both sides. They're going to take Iran and portion of Pakistan. And you can demonstrate this. You can demonstrate this from the Word of God, as we'll endeavour to do now. So what about this Daniel 11 verse 40? Well, it says this. And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him. Now just stop there. Who's this him referred to here? Well, I'm going to make the statement. A little bit later on we'll have a slide that will amplify it. You know, context is everything in biblical interpretation. You must not go against the context. And so the context of verse 36 to 39 of Daniel 11 is about a king. And that king just happens to be the power established in Constantinople. And this is the him of verse 40. It's that king described in verses 36 to 39. It's the power, whoever it might be, established in Constantinople or modern Istanbul. So when we read at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, the power installed in Constantinople, that, brothers and sisters, is a fulfilled prophecy. Because in 1917, Britain, who was the occupying power of Egypt, pushed the Turks out of Palestine. Australian soldiers were actually involved in that. Do you see, it says, at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him. Now, in this chapter, Daniel 11, we have the history, the long history of the conflict between two powers, with Israel, God's people, in the middle. They were used as the trampling ground of these two powers. There was what was called the king of the north. Now, the king of the north was the power of the Greeks under a man called Seleucus. He was one of the four generals of Alexander. When Alexander died, the four generals eventually divided up his kingdom into four parts, and there were two dominant parts. There was the Seleucid kingdom that went from Syria right across to western Pakistan, to the Indus River. And there was the kingdom of Ptolemy, another general of his, that was based on Egypt. It became known as the Ptolemaic kingdom, and the Bible calls that the king of the south. So to be called the king of the south, you have to be, as in history, a foreign occupying power of Egypt. Well, Britain went into Egypt in the 1880s, and they were there until the early 1950s. And it was in that period that the First World War was fought. And from Egypt, the British, who controlled Egypt, sent their forces, and they drove the Turks, whose capital was there in Constantinople, they drove the Turks out of Palestine. That's what it means here when it says, in the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, the power occupying Constantinople. So that's fulfilled. The king of the south's no longer there. Not needed, in fact. But there is a king of the north coming. He's not here yet, but it's coming. Because to be called the king of the north, you have to be a foreign occupying power of the territory from Syria to Pakistan. You have to control the old Seleucid kingdom. And of course, Russia is now on the western fringes of that territory. That's what makes this so interesting. So Russia is the occupying power of Syria, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan and Pakistan will invade the Middle East via Turkey. So when we have a look at this situation, you're going to see exactly what's happening now is leading up to very dramatic events. So who is this him? Daniel 11:40? As I said, you've got to go back to verses 36 to 39. It identifies the king as the little horn of the goat. The Roman Empire ruled from Constantinople in support of the papacy and the Catholic Church. And Brother Thomas said this in Help Us Israel. He says, it matters not whether they be pagan Romans, Catholic Greeks, Muslim Turks, or Greek Catholic Russians. The power that rules in Constantinople and plants its standard in Assyria is the little horn of the Assyro-Babylonian horn of the goat. And we're watching this come to pass. So here we've got the situation when Gog becomes the king of the north. You see this green area here? That is the old Seleucid kingdom. So to be called the king of the north, you need to have control of that territory. Russia has now got troops in Syria. And you can see where this is heading, can't you? I think most of the world can probably they got a hunch that this is not going to stop here. That it's not going to Russia's going to defeat ISIS and get out of Syria. Israel doesn't believe that. They've got a hunch. Well, we don't have to have a hunch. We know what's going to happen. Russia is going to take control of this area. They are going to stamp the residue with defeat. And that is going to become under Russian political control, that area that you can see. And when they've got that, they are the king of the north. And then we read in Daniel 11:40 that the king of the north comes against him, the power occupying Constantinople. But they don't stop there either, do they? Because we then read in Daniel chapter 11, in the final verses of that chapter, that they come down the coastal plain of Lebanon and Israel. They send many ships and they come down into Egypt, which is their primary target, and we know the rest. They then are drawn back to the land, and we have the events of Ezekiel 38, the Battle of Armageddon, and so on. So what this means is that Gog, the Russian power, is going to go through several phases on its way to Armageddon. It has to become the king of the north, and it can only do that when the Seleucid territory is controlled. At that time, of course, when they become the king of the north, they take the Seleucid territory, they become the Assyrian. The Assyrian, because that's the territory of the ancient Assyrian Empire as well, or at least portion of it. They then become the little horn of the goat when they acquire Constantinople and they re-establish the eastern leg of the image. And then when they come into Egypt, they're called the cruel Lord of Isaiah 19 and verse 4. So there are the phases through which Gog passes on their way to Armageddon. Now we mentioned this afternoon, brethren and sisters and young people and friends, that when this is all happening, amazing things will be happening between Russia and Israel. Russia is the latter-day Assyrian of the prophecies of Isaiah and Micah. And this is all based on history. It's all happened before. Based on the invasion of Judah in the days of Hezekiah, which is used in the Word of God as a type of Armageddon. And the destruction of the Russian forces outside the walls of Jerusalem was prefigured by the destruction of the 185,000 Assyrians who perished outside the walls of Jerusalem in the days of Hezekiah. And so, the father of Hezekiah, faithless Ahaz, is the type of modern Israel who made the first pact with the Assyrians, 2 Kings 16, 7-9. And his rationale? Help against his internal enemies to the north and against Syria. Guess what Israel's problems today are? Enemies directly to the north, the Hezbollah, and Syria, and a bit further beyond in Iran. Exactly the same problems. And that's where they're going to go for help. So what about these Syrians? You know, we didn't know much about Syria, did we? Until the newspapers are full of it. What about these Syrians? Well, the Syrians were subdued in circa 720 BC by the Assyrians under Tiglath-Pileser. Why? Why did that happen? Well, at that time Damascus was taken and destroyed. It lay in ruins for 40 years. And the inhabitants were carried away into Assyria, as the record of 2 Kings 16, 7-9 tells us. In that, prophecy was fulfilled. The prophecy of Isaiah 17 and verse 1 was fulfilled, that Damascus would be a ruinous heap. Now, of course, Bible prophecy very often has a primary application and a secondary application. And there is going to be a secondary application. Ever seen pictures of Damascus lately? It's already half in ruins, isn't it? It's not going to take too much more for Damascus to be in ruins. And when the Russians make their move, that's exactly what's going to happen. So the kingdom of Syria remained a province of Assyria till the capture of Nineveh by the Medes in 625 BC, when it fell under the conquerors. So here are your prophecies, or at least prophecies in history. 2 Kings 16 and verse 9 says, "And the king of Assyria hearkened unto Ahaz, king of Judah, for the king of Assyria went up against Damascus and took it, and carried the people of it captive to Kir, and slew Rezin their king." And the prophecy of Isaiah 17 verse 1 prophesied that Damascus should be taken away from being a city and should be a ruinous heap. And Amos 1 verse 4 said that Yahweh would send a fire into the house of Hazael, who was at a previous time king of Syria, which should devour the palaces of Ben-Hadad. Jeremiah 49 verses 24 to 25 presaged, "Damascus is waxed feeble. How is the city of praise not left, the city of my joy?" In fact, that's not a great translation. The interlinear scriptural analyzer says, "How is it that the boasted city," now they boast about the city, "is not forsaken by its defenders," it means. The town of elation. This refers to the fact that the inhabitants of the city failed to flee when they had warning signs that the Assyrians were on the way. And in fact, if you go to verse 26 of Jeremiah 49, it foretells the fall of the young defenders who had confidence. They were boasting in this city, but it was wiped out and lay in ruins for 40 years. And by the time of the Medo-Persian supremacy, Damascus had not only been rebuilt, but was the most famous city in Syria according to the historian Strabo. Now, I know that was all a bit of a flurry, but you're thinking about what's going to happen to Syria? Damascus is doomed, no question about it. And then the Russian forces creep right across to the Indus River, take half of Pakistan, and they'll have control of that entire region, and there will be the residue stamped beneath their feet. That's why we can say in our title, there's a crisis in the residue. It's coming, brothers and sisters. And the fact that this year, 2015, sees Russia next door to Israel, there in Syria, is one of the most dramatic things that's happened in our time. No question about it. It's a great sign of things to come. But what about this agreement, this covenant that will exist, scripturally must exist between Russia and Israel in the latter days? That gives Israel the opportunity to take down their walls and bars and gates, to get rid of the problems of Hezbollah and Hamas under Russian agreement. What does this mean? Well, it means disaster for Israel, doesn't it? Because we know from Ezekiel 38 verse 10 it says this, "At the same time," it says of Gog, "shall things come into thy mind, and thou shalt think an evil thought." You know, there's nothing much more evil than to make a solemn covenant and then to break it behind people's backs. Nothing much more evil than that. On August the 23rd, 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. This is pre-World War II. The World War II started on what date? 1st of September 1939, when Hitler crossed the border with Poland. So this is a month or so, or not even so, weeks, 23rd? It's a week before the beginning of the Second World War. There was this non-aggression pact between Germany and Russia. agreeing that the two countries would not attack each other. The pact, of course, was broken when Nazi Germany attacked the Soviet Union less than 2 years later, in the summer, the northern summer of 1941. You know, Stalin was so stunned by that attack that he didn't appear in public for 2 weeks. His voice was not heard on radio. He could not believe it. He was like a lump of jelly. He could not believe that Hitler would break this pact. And you know, he was so confident that Hitler wouldn't break the pact, that he wouldn't need a strong army, that he'd shot his best generals. Because his best generals, well, of course, were competition to his leadership. So he shot them. So you see, this is exactly the position that Israel's going to find itself in, isn't it? They're going to have absolute confidence that the covenant that they make with the Assyrian is going to hold. They're going to disarm. They're not going to be ready when this treachery of Gog occurs. Yeah. Well, when might it occur? When might Russia make a move across from Syria to Pakistan? Well, there's some pressure on them. This is the report from Radio Free Europe in October this year. Russian Finance Minister Anton, whatever his name is, says the country's reserve fund could be exhausted by the end of 2016 if world energy prices remain at current levels. Another little thing from UniCredit. Russia is going to be in a very difficult fiscal situation by 2017. By the end of next year, meaning 2016, there won't be any money left in the oil reserve fund. Then we read in Bloomberg's, this New York magazine, 23rd of July of this year, Russia is already in dire straits, they said. The economy has contracted by 4.9% over the past year, and the downturn is certain to drag on as oil prices crumble after a tentative rally. Half of Russia's tax income comes from oil and gas. So when you're selling oil at $38 a barrel, when you used to get 117 or whatever it might have been, your coffers are going to be empty pretty quick, aren't they? Well, you know what Brother Thomas wrote about that, don't you? In Help Us Israel, page 367, he wrote this: "Let the Russian treasury be as empty as it's said to be, and its expenditure exceed its revenue by double the alleged deficit. It will only operate as a pressure from within, causing her autocrat to enter into the countries and to overflow and pass over and to enrich himself with the spoil of those he is destined to subdue." And that's exactly what Hitler did prior to the Second World War. The reason that Hitler went in and took the Rhineland was it was an industrial area. It was like a sort of like a no man's land. He went and took it. Then he went and took Austria, his place of birth. Then he went and took the Sudetenland, the German-speaking area of Western Czechoslovakia. And then he went and took the rest of Czechoslovakia. This is all before World War II starts. Why did he do that? Read the historians. He did it because Germany was broke. They were broke. And the only way they could survive was to consume the territories of other nations. You ever read Habakkuk 2 recently? It talks about this Gogian power. It's the latter-day dictatorial power from the north. It talks about it consuming one nation after another. Yep. So when Russia makes its move and takes that entire area right across to Pakistan, they'll do it largely out of economic factors. The need to secure this territory, to secure the economic benefits of capturing that territory. And then later on, of course, the pressure comes on again, and down they come into the Middle East. I want to conclude tonight by reminding you of what's happening on the border with Syria. It was reported on the 7th of October 2015, a huge discovery of oil in the Golan Heights. And this is what the article said: if the oil can be extracted at a reasonable cost, and that is the big if now, because you're only getting $38 a barrel, it would make Israel self-sufficient for decades. Drilling more than a year ago has exposed a huge find of billions of barrels of oil. Now, this is the area. See this black area? Well, here's the Sea of Galilee. This is where the Syrian border used to be. This is the current border, which has ISIS-related guerrillas on it. Russia is just up here to the north, okay? And they found this huge quantity of oil in the Golan Heights. You reckon this is accidental? And why hadn't they found it before? You see, there's got to be divine activity. The angels are involved in this. The article goes on to say this: Syrian rebels, ISIS, and the Assad regime, and today that means Russia, now have another reason to capture the Golan Heights. You ever heard those words before down there? Art thou come to take a spoil? Hast thou come to take a prey? How close are we, brothers and sisters? How close are we? We don't know exactly when our Lord will come, but we know the signs which have built up exponentially in 2015 are screaming at us that the day is at hand. What we need to do is to make sure that in what little opportunities we have got left, we put every effort into preparing ourselves and others for the inevitable day when our Lord will be in the earth. We have been given more signs than we deserve, in fact. Our God has been very gracious to us. Let's make sure we don't waste what he has done for us. This day is coming.